My name is Monica Monk. I'm a student in the Master of Arts program in Professional and Creative Writing here at Central Washington University. I was born and raised in the Puget Sound region of Washington State and have been teaching in the Washington State Community and Technical College system since 1999. I'm going to read a piece of creative nonfiction that I wrote in the fall of 2021 for Professor Katharine Whitcomb's seminar, Introduction to Graduate Writing. The assignment was to write an open letter to the editors of our textbook, The Racial Imaginary, which is an anthology of open letters on the topic of race and writing. You can see it behind me here. Due to the time constraints of the source presentation, I'll be reading pieces of my essay or open letter. How to structure the letter and what to write was left obviously open. Mine begins like this. Transcript, Travelogue, open letter to Claudia Rankine. Dear open letter, I'm standing at a desk in the corner of a half-furnished, chilly room with a frayed wool rug laid over floors stripped down to the plywood and nails, which is the space where I've been teaching during our COVID lockdown in Washington State. I'm alone but connected in significant ways to about 70 beginning community college students to whom I teach freshman composition. Stewarding English 101 is an awful responsibility. It is acknowledged as one of 3 classes which heavily impact students' chances of successfully earning the degree. Until the lockdown, for 2 decades, I mainly taught English to international students. English was a sandbox for myself and my students, who spoke different languages but mainly used English to get the business of teaching and learning and building relationships done. I taught everything, speaking, pronunciation, reading, grammar, writing, but mostly, and always increasingly over the years, writing. This is a letter about race and writing. I taught and teach writing to classes full of people of different races, ethnicities, cultures, and nationalities. Here on this page, I could continue writing about race and culture in my classes. I could write about learning of differences between the Islam of the Caucasus and the Islam of Iran during a heated dispute between a dentist's wife and a 17-year-old black belt in karate. I could write that some people have the ability to sew Parisian fashion from sight, like others play music by ear, and in fact are able to acquire this ability in a Congolese orphanage. That young men in their military service slept in the snow of the DMZ between North and South Korea. I could share my snapshot knowledge of Uyghur houses, Mongolian ranches with pet camels that could crush you with their affection. I could tell you that people survived terrible events and still sat in my classroom, and that they overcame incredible hardship and went on to achieve incredible things. I'll be honest, I did write about some of that for the first few hours. You won't see it here because I deleted it. Just because it is deleted, though, does not mean that this travelogue of my journey is not still ghosting around here in the back of this letter. On a positive side, it did bring me to this question. So where do I go with this instead? The answer to this question is that I have landed at the tropes that Loffreda and Rankine find in writings about race. I needed to travel to see race. I needed to travel to see race. I wasn't literally traveling in those years of teaching students of diverse cultural, ethnic, racial, and linguistic backgrounds. In a sense, though, I was the traveler who needed to travel to see race. Over the years, our outcomes contained such well-intended declarations as that the students should work collaboratively with others from diverse backgrounds, or that they should become friends. As I learned my trade and listened to and read my students' stories of their lives, I addressed diversity enthusiastically in these intensive English programs. I addressed race in America in my own and my students' corner of it. Now thinking back, I gave the illusion of doing so, and perhaps mostly to myself. The Racial Imaginary project began originally as a website on which Claudia Rankine posted her own open letter about race and the creative imagination in March 2011. Responses were solicited and posted to the website, then later compiled into this anthology. Students in Professor Whitcomb's seminar were asked to write their own open letter as a class assignment. The format of an open letter is described in Loffreda and Rankine's foreword to the collection as personal, intimate meditations like letters that would nevertheless be available to an audience of more than one. At the time that I wrote this, late in the time of online teaching during this pandemic, I had no idea that that audience would be you. What you are about to hear now is indeed a very personal meditation on and revisiting of an experience that I had a long time ago at the beginning of my teaching career. 20 years ago, I was part-time, non-tenured faculty and had just been hired to teach a couple of classes in the English department, including a pre-college composition class for English language learners. Enrollments in the intensive English program, where I had originally been hired to teach, had dropped precipitously since 9/11, so I felt incredibly fortunate to have been hired and trusted to teach these English composition classes at this former college. It felt like a step up to me at that time. Though I was an outsider in that department, I did have a few friends, including one who was tenured and had been at the college for a long time. And one day, we were reading an essay on race in America in the really thick reader that was used in the class. I was struggling with planning for the class discussion, and I asked my friend, who was a very experienced English faculty member and who was Black, for help. She graciously offered to visit the class and speak with the students about the essay. I was really relieved, as I was brand new to teaching English composition, afraid to talk about race in the class, and because of my tenuous quarterly contracted status, fearful of saying the wrong things in class. This happened 20 years ago, so many details are fuzzy. What I do remember vividly is the students' reaction, and in particular, one student's. This class visit occurred long enough ago that I no longer exactly remember what my colleague said, save for that she brought up Christopher Columbus at one point and that she explained white supremacy. I also remember this. The students listened raptly and clapped hard at the end of the class, and an Uzbek student told me the next day that he had recorded the lecture and played it again and was writing a transcript. Looking back, a couple of things strike me. One, how discomfited I felt when he told me he was transcribing her lecture. In the early 2000s, it was not easy to record a professor discreetly as it is now with cell phones. However, what unbalanced my still precarious sense of balance as an English composition teacher was that he had transcribed my colleague's lecture on race. Why, I wondered insecurely. So many years later, I mostly remember my experienced colleague's dynamic lecture style that lit up and levitated the class beyond the essay about race in our textbook, Rereading America, and how differently that class day turned out from how I imagined it would. I say this because for that class session, I felt that I had disappeared for the students. I felt invisible. It was as though they had all teleported onto another planet and left me alone in the classroom. The writing of this memory makes me uncomfortable. It felt uncomfortable then, and the memory still does today, nearly 2 decades later. For one thing, I realized that I had asked my colleague, who was Black, to perform invisible labor in the name of friendship and collegiality and speak about race to my class because I felt unequipped and scared. I acknowledged my whiteness just insofar as to make it an excuse for why I could not speak about race in America with my class of students from around the world to whom I was teaching writing, as if writing were something separate from race, and a white teacher of writing could afford to teach writing without acknowledging her own race and without taking the risks of speaking about race herself. And secondly, in writing this letter, I've been questioning why I felt so disturbed that my student had transcribed my colleague's lecture on race in America. It felt messy and unplanned. It felt as though I were outside of a complicity and at the same time implicated. In the next days, the wrinkled, college-ruled pages onto which the student had inked the words, he had showed them to me with a reverence and excitement that I thought approached zeal, occupied my thoughts and puzzled me. Now, as I write this letter, the fat textbook, Rereading America, comes to mind with its hundreds of thin, typed pages and themes, and I think I might know why. In his open letter in The Racial Imaginary, Farid Maktouk asks how a poet occupying an othered position today might use what he quotes another writer as calling a chaotic accumulation of positions to seize a sort of agency and rhetorical power. The image of the archer in this slide represents the precision of the drawing back of the bow and release of the arrow to hit the target, even while the archer is unable to aim directly at the target. What happens next is when my student metaphorically shoots an arrow and hits a target. My colleague gave my student what I had not given him in this English composition class with the socially themed textbook, our 5 days in class each week, or our 4 typed essays: narrative, classification, comparison, contrast, problem solution, an unmediated opportunity to write about race. His act of writing down her words was an act of listening. Writing my colleague's lecture down in his own script on his own paper reclaimed the agenda that Rereading America and I had set for the class. My discomfort at the existence of this act of writing outside of the norms and expectations of our classroom or curriculum was an act of not listening. This letter is an attempt to write a transcript of sorts for myself of what was happening in a scene where I had turned the volume way down. I cannot pretend that I've transcended this story by writing about it and reaching a new conclusion. The volume is turned up, and the writing seems to situate me squarely in the very same structure of whiteness and writing that I have been attempting to write about. The best I can do at the moment of writing this letter, I think, is to acknowledge this position as a writer and teacher of writing inside of this structure of white supremacy. I am again at square one at the beginning of this narrative. So where do I go with this instead? To me now, as I unpack the story more fully than I ever have, it becomes a kind of transcript of its own. It is an untangling of my whiteness and position in front of a classroom full of students from their own complex inheritances, the illusion of a college composition classroom, and my own then and now different kinds of discomfort at the disruption of this illusion by the opening of a space in the class and a student who moved into a racial imaginary where, despite everything, race and writing merged. Sincerely, Monica.